Welcome, and I want to thank you all for coming out and braving the Seattle traffic for this first in a series of panels. And I also want to start with a special thank you to our panelists in favor of the $15 an hour wage increase. It's hard enough for people to speak in public, and it's much harder when you're coming before a crowd you largely disagree with. So I want to put a special thank you out to them. First, I want to address my bias. I am the moderator today, and some people might be thinking, wait a second, that's the guy who hosts the morning show. I know he has strong opinions. Well, my goal is to encourage a lively, informative, and passionate discussion. It may at times get heated, but my objective is to make sure it doesn't get mean-spirited. When Brit Hume was an anchor at ABC News, he said that everybody in the media has a bias. The problem is they refuse to recognize it. So I recognize that I have a bias, but in order to accommodate for that as moderator tonight, I've drawn questions from materials presented by the $15 an hour minimum wage hike advocates and requested suggestions from a liberal perspective, including that of our sister station, 97.3 Cairo FM. Host Dave Ross kindly provided me with some suggestions this evening. So you will hear I will try and adopt a liberal perspective when I am questioning Ben Shapiro and Paul Guppy, and I will try and adopt a more conservative perspective when I'm questioning our other panelists. So, two producers in the audience, Chris Martin and my own producer, Nicole, if they're here. We couldn't get up so early and do all these things without them. So if you catch them, thank them for making that possible. Now our participants. First up, Deputy Director of the National Employment Law Project, Rebecca Smith. Next, the Vice President for Research at the Washington Policy Center, Paul Guppy. Seattle City Councilwoman Kshama Sawant. And best-selling author, columnist, editor, and KTTH Afternoon Drive host, Ben Shapiro. For the first portion of this event, I'll ask questions of the panelists designed to broaden into larger discussions. Each question will be directed to a specific panelist who will have at most a couple of minutes to answer, followed by observations and counterpoints made from other panelists. I'll try to keep the conversation relatively relaxed, but occasionally I may have to intervene to move things along. And again, I do alternate the questions. However, I did want to start with this, number one, first of all. Can we all at least agree that we would like to see people earning more and see less poverty? Not the most controversial question. Everybody agrees? Starting with agreement.
Is that the debate right there?
Excellent, right there. I think we've solved everything. Have a good evening. Question number one. Some people making below $15 an hour, and this is directed to you, Ben. Some people making below $15 an hour make ends meet by receiving government benefits in the form of food stamps and/or other subsidies. Some assert that this essentially means governments have enabled businesses to pay less and keep more for their bottom lines, resulting in subsidized corporate profits and people more dependent on government. Ben Shapiro, as a conservative who advocates for less dependency on government, why do you object to this reasoning?
I don't object to that reasoning. I think it's 100% true. I think the major problem that we have with regard to food stamps supplementing people's wages is that these companies are being paid off by the government. I mean, they're getting enormous subsidies from the federal government in the form of food stamps, and there are two ways that you can correct that in terms of wages. The first way that you can correct that in terms of wages would be with a measure like the minimum wage, which, as we'll argue about tonight, decreases, in my opinion, employment. The evidence, I believe, tends to show that it decreases employment, or at the very least puts a cap on it and makes it more difficult for small businesses to operate while big businesses are still getting these subsidies. And second of all, it creates a corrupt system where certain businesses benefit more than others. The second way that you're going to be able to prevent all of this is if you cut back a lot of these subsidies, forcing businesses to compete for labor. Labor is just like any other good in a free market. That means that people have to compete for it. So if you want wages to go up, then get rid of the government paying the other half of the wage, and you will see the wages automatically increase. I think that we should all be able to agree on the idea that wages need to increase. I think the difference is that the way to make wages increase is to have a fully consensual relationship between employer and employee. And I think this is really the root of the morality of minimum wage when it comes down to it. And in 2 sentences here is that I would never force an employee to work for an employer at a given wage. That violates the 13th Amendment and constitutes slavery or indentured servitude. By the same token, I would never force an employer to pay a given wage to an employee, because that is a lack of consent on the part of the employer and violates basic principles of fairness as well as freedom.
Let's hear from the let's hear from the other side. Would either of you like to address that question?
Sure. So I think we can agree on certain ground realities in this economy. Ben is completely right. Big business is gaining at the expense of small business. That is true. And if you look at who are the workers we are talking about, who are the low-wage workers, who are the people who would benefit from increase in minimum wage, we have to step back and understand that this is a problem of inequality. And the reality is that nearly half of the people who are eligible for food stamps and who actually exercise their right to get it are working people, not lazy people who sit at home. This is what we often think about. But the reality is that they are working people. They need that subsidy because they don't make enough money. So in reality, all the money that you and I pay as taxpayers in order to fund these welfare programs are not subsidizing workers. They're subsidizing Walmart in order to enable them to pay very low wages. So this is really you paying a subsidy to a giant corporation that is making massive profits. And the businesses that gain the most by having workers at low wages are big businesses. If you look at local businesses and small businesses, they do rely on workers and people, consumers who live in the neighborhoods, having a little bit more income than their basic needs to be able to go and buy goods and services at local businesses. So if you look at all the minimum wage increases that have happened in different places, it's small businesses that benefit from them because they now have consumers that can actually pay for them. And as far as the consensual relationship is concerned, the $15 an hour struggle is not something that is coming from the White House or from some big government. It is workers at the bottom saying that they can't live on really a low wage, and they are coming out in movements and saying that they need a living wage, and it's their right because they're the ones who make the city run.
Paul, do you agree with Ben's reasoning?
Well, the point about this that's always been interesting to me is that the reason I guess we agree across the board that programs like food stamps end up subsidizing companies is because that's a mechanism that actually works. The question is, that actually happens. The question is, why does that happen? So what it seems to me is strange is when policymakers create a program which creates a legal entitlement, people take advantage of the entitlement, that has an effect on subsidizing wages for the employers, that's true, and then that program is criticized. So that's a case of policy analysis of where Congress needs to look at the program and see what are the unintended fallout effects in the economy of providing subsidies for people that also create the problem of dependency. So we're going to be debating here quite a bit about earned income and work and how that leads to independence, and that's what really lifts people out of poverty, not continued subsidies through programs that the government has provided. So I think the problem is in the structure of those programs and how they affect the labor market.
Rebecca, would you like to add?
I would. I want to say thanks first for having us here to have what is a reasoned and impassioned debate. And it's really, being in a more hostile audience for me is really not very different than having dinner with my relatives. So it's all good.
Are we related?
Try being a conservative. Yeah, try being a conservative Jew.
So, Bloomberg News described Walmart and McDonald's as the biggest welfare queens in the country. we are subsidizing Walmart and McDonald's and other huge employers that are making record profits to the tune of about $3.8 billion a year. I think we disagree, though, on how to make that change. If we did increase the minimum wage here to $15 an hour, a family of 3 that is now receiving food stamps would receive near zero in food stamps, and that would relieve you and me from paying for those benefits. It sounds to me like what you all are talking about is sort of going back to before 1938, before we had any sort of public assistance programs and before we had minimum wage, and to me that really raises the specter of kids working in mines and people dying on the job because there are no rules.
Bring back the 1890s.
I can't really believe that that's where you're going.
You're correct that it's not where we're going.
I want to go there. I have a 10-month-old. Can't I put her to a 10-week-old? Can I put her to work yet? And what's the problem? She needs to start earning. Come on.
All right, we're bound to cover some of that ground as the questions progress. So let's move on to question number 2. Councilmember Sawant, Walmart has expressed a willingness to support a minimum wage increase so long as it pertains to all businesses. Most of the opposition to the 15 now seems to come from smaller companies rather than large corporations. Does the $15 an hour wage favor large business interests over their potential rivals?
It is true that the face of the opposition to $15 an hour has been small businesses, but the reality is that the force behind this is the elephant in the room, which is big business. We're always stuck in this sort of, circular logic of, how small businesses are going to be affected. And let's look at the data. Let's get away from emotions and feelings, and let's look at what's happened in the past when minimum wage was increased. And I'm not talking about 100 years ago. I'm talking about what's happened since 2003 in many different cities. And what you see is an overwhelming evidence that small businesses gain, local businesses gain when consumers around them have more money in their pockets to be able to spend on extras, little extras. We're not talking about being able to pay your rent. It's absolutely essential to be able to pay your rent, especially in a city like Seattle. But who are the people who gain from basic need payments like paying your rent? It's big developers. It's not small businesses that gain. Small businesses gain when they have a little, when households have a little extra after they've paid for their basic needs. And why is it that they gain when the lowest paid workers have a little more money in their pockets? They gain that because the lowest paid workers, and we're talking about 100,000 workers in Seattle, this is not a small number, they can only spend in local businesses because they don't have the money to fly off to Paris for a vacation. So it's no use giving more money to already rich people. They're not going to come and spend, and they're not going to buy more from your businesses because they've already bought what they need, and the rest of the cash that they have is sitting in their bank accounts, or they're making massive real estate investments somewhere else, not in Seattle. So if you want to benefit businesses in Seattle, actually disproportionately more than big business, it should. I mean, if you care about small businesses, I appeal to you to join me in fighting for a higher minimum wage, because that is what will benefit small businesses.
Okay. Ben, do you want to respond to that? Does the minimum wage, does the minimum wage increase favor large businesses over their potential rivals?
I mean, of course it does. And folks, if you're not asked the question, please don't answer it. As far as as far as does it favor big businesses over small businesses, the answer is of course it does. The reason big businesses are big business is because they have economies of scale, which allow them to absorb an increase in cost in a way that small businesses simply can't. If you have 3 employees, it's going to be a lot harder for you to absorb a 60% increase in your cost bottom line than it is for a company like McDonald's, which has economies of scale across the entire nation. I think there's a general point to be made here, with regard to, and maybe we'll get to it later, so maybe I'm jumping the gun, with regard to income inequality. We've labeled that a problem. I don't believe that income inequality as a moral matter is a basic problem, because I don't care if people are rich. I think there are too many poor people. That's not a problem of equality, that's a problem of poverty.
We actually will be speaking about that earlier, so. One more thing, while I enjoy the enthusiasm, we'll move through the questions faster. If you could hold applause and or jeers to the end of the round of the question. Like when I say, all right, we're going to move to the next question, that will make it so that we'll be able to move through more questions and explore more issues. Paul, any comments?
So to add to this point, and again, in a way it builds on the way that federal programs end up subsidizing big business. The same is true of the minimum wage, because anytime that the government imposes across-the-board mandate on the economy, those organizations which are best positioned to game the system or gain advantages or have lobbyists or exercise power with the government, and that's big businesses, they're always going to find a way to come out ahead. So the more that the government tries to create fairness or equality by interfering in the economy, changing the rules of the game, corporations are always going to have an advantage. And a minimum wage privileges large businesses and also online businesses, making it even harder for the Main Street retailer to compete because people just look for alternatives online or someplace else.
Rebecca, I'll give you the last word on this.
It's really hard for me to understand that big business is so privileged by the minimum wage because the big companies are paying some of the lowest wages. And in fact, 2/3 of the low-wage workers in this country are working for businesses of 100 people or more. So I guess I just don't understand what it is how it privileges big business.
What are their profit
The reality is, and the proof of that the minimum wage works for everybody, is that there had been dozens of studies, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, that look at all business, and business does fine after a minimum wage is increased. And this is why. Because business, as Kshama said earlier, depends on consumers. So if we raise wages, people who don't have money now have money to spend. And low-wage workers spend money locally for things that are food and clothes, and maybe they save for education. They're not buying expensive trips. They're not spending money like rich folks that, are making so much money they couldn't spend it an entire lifetime. They're spending it in local businesses. Local businesses get customers. They do well. They hire more people. So raising the minimum wage is essential to our economic recovery.
And Rebecca's point brings us directly to the next question. There you go. Henry Ford's increase in wages for his assembly line workers is often cited as evidence for increasing wages for the sake of economic activity, some of which Rebecca just described. Following that logic, Paul Guppy, from an economic perspective, regardless of someone's skill level or work ethic, don't we need more customers with money to spend so that people who do have a work ethic can make a buck and have a better customer base?
Okay, great point. Okay, so in 1913 in Detroit, a new industry, the automotive industry, there were literally dozens of auto manufacturers at the time, and turnover in the auto industry was tremendous. One of the things that Henry Ford was trying to accomplish was stop the turnover. If he could just get his skilled workers to stay for at least a year, that would create stability in his business, and that actually ended up working. So he proposed the $5 a day wage, which he did voluntarily, by the way. So that was a competitive business decision that he made. It wasn't imposed on him. He voluntarily offered it, and the best workers voluntarily accepted it. It was a business model that worked in that industry at the time. You fast forward to today, we're talking about imposing a mandate, and we can get into the morality of whether the government should interfere between a willing job offerer and a person who's willing to work at that wage. The thing about 15 now is it makes $14 an hour illegal immediately, and you're not allowed to work at that wage even if you want to. Moving forward to today, we live in an economy that's much more competitive where consumers have choices. So in a way, the 15 now movement is more like the Bellevue Square enrichment movement, because consumers will, as prices rise in Seattle in response, people will move to other areas in the region to do their shopping, or more likely is they'll go online. So the Queen Anne bookstore, which is trying to compete against Amazon, is immediately going to be put at a disadvantage.
Rebecca, why don't you respond?
Sure, 2 points. This question of a willing worker and a willing employer, I don't think anyone can seriously argue that individuals who are working for McDonald's or Walmart have the power to negotiate their wage with their employer. I think most people
Government
here
has the power to
probably,
put them out of work.
I think, well, not true. The second question, and really wage and worth is all about power. If workers can band together and can demand a certain wage and can meet the power of an employer, fine. But workers who are working hard are falling behind and their jobs are worthy. Is it really, we can talk about whether people are worth $15 an hour, but is the CEO of Walmart worth $20 million a year? Really? Really? You believe that?
Hold on. No,
Okay,
I want to
second
encourage,
question.
if you have some conversation between you, I don't want it to be so formal that you feel like you can't interject or discuss with one
Okay.
another.
Second question, second issue about turnover and morale in Henry Ford. That was true in Henry Ford's day, but it's true today as well. If you look at the studies about the minimum wage, when the minimum wage goes up, there are huge benefits to business. There is less turnover. People show up to work, less absenteeism. There's more great morale. When I get a wage raise, I know I feel a lot better. People have less grievances. There are less disciplinary problems. People take care of machinery better. So things are better now when people get a minimum wage increase, just as they were in Henry Ford's day.
Council member?
Well, I think we have to, step back and see that, look around look at the world around us, look at your own lives. I would bet that the majority of the audience here is not billionaires or not even millionaires. I would bet that just have jobs, you have to show up to work in order to earn your livelihood. And I think that, you have to acknowledge the reality, regardless of which end of the ideological spectrum you're on, that this idea that the relationship between a corporation and a worker is an entirely voluntary one is a figment of our imagination. The reality is that the relationship depends upon the balance of power. Because if you were to really believe that it's totally a voluntary relationship, then you should be arguing for child labor, because that was legal at one time, and that was argued as a beneficial thing for the economy. And people had to fight against that. People who were outraged and absolutely morally, we're talking about morality, right? People who are morally disgusted at the idea of their children being put to work instead of having childhoods had to fight against it. They had to organize mass movements around it. So we have to understand that it's a balance of power.
We're moving ever so slightly away from whether we need customers with more money to have that base, but we'll be addressing some of the underage working here shortly. Ben,
Yeah,
your perspective?
I'll refrain from talking about child labor, especially given the fact that the rationale for child labor laws is that children are incapable of consent, right? I mean, that's the rationale for
Although
child labor
your child
laws.
did appear on television last night.
She did, without her consent, but I will tell you that she immediately joined SAG-AFTRA.
The rationale for child labor to be legal was that children are exploitable, more exploitable. That's why businesses wanted it, and people had to fight against it.
Businesses may want it, but the fact is that the children are not capable of consent, which is why the legislation was appropriate from all ideological points of view. In terms of whether basically this trickle-up economics, this idea that if you pay people $15 an hour, it will help the general economy, it's evidencing a differential point of view with regard to how money is invested and what makes your life as a consumer better. The truth is that Mother Teresa did less good for the world than Bill Gates, as a general matter. Because more people gained their jobs through Bill Gates, more people have a product that Bill Gates created, more people's lives have been bettered through Bill Gates. Mother Teresa did a lot of wonderful things. But the reality of the situation is that what makes your life better than people's lives were 50 years ago is all the new products and services developed by all the rich people who hire you. All of you out there who I'm sure are not rich, are you working for a poor person right now? Who is hiring you? Who's paying your salary? Unless you're